Hello everyone, my name is Catherine Peck and I will be presenting a project on white privilege today that I like to call the Privilege Pop. So please enjoy this presentation. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to let me know. I hope you enjoy this, and here we go. This is the white privilege project, the Privilege Pop. What the Privilege Pop is a presentation which will be presented to resident assistants at the University of Wisconsin-Platteville, hopefully at their summer training session. So what the Privilege Pop will be is an introductory activity to privilege. Basically, just getting the students' feet wet on what privilege is and how to identify it, and kind of some processing pieces through privilege as well. So what I would like to do in terms of the program initially itself is to gather and collaborate with some student leaders on campus, student staff, as well as staff and academic staff on campus in order to talk to them and see if they're willing to participate and give me their real life privileges. So, or just where they are on the spectrum, whether they lack certain privileges or not. So basically their demographic, what's their race, their gender, their sexual orientation, their religion, their financial standing, that sort of thing, to see where they are on the privilege spectrum and see just a diverse view of what privilege looks like on our campus with different people. So the reason that I am doing this is because during the project I would like to kind of take away the ambivalence that students may feel when doing a privilege walk sort of activity. So if they are given a specific identity rather than focusing on their own identity, I think they can still see the privileges and lack thereof that may be happening on this campus, and that way they may not have as much of a personal tie. They may or may not, depending on the person that they're assigned, but it will open their eyes to privilege so that they can see what's happening without having too much personal connection in the initial activity. So what we will do in the activity itself is I'll probably grab about 4 or 5 people, and we will have a whole bunch of balloons, and I'm thinking about we will have tie about 10 balloons to each person. Each of the balloons will represent a different identity, so your race, your gender, sexual orientation, etc. So what we will do then is, once everyone has the 10 balloons assigned to them and on their arms, we will assign them one of the people that we took ahead of time in the collaboration, and we will look at those identities and say, okay, we notice that your person, or whomever you are, you identify as white. So we are going to cut off a balloon because that is a privilege. So that's one less thing that is getting in your way. So we'll go through these people, and all of our 4 volunteers will have different privileges and lack of privileges, and I want a spectrum of the people to see that these balloons, the ones that haven't been cut off, are getting in your way and preventing people from doing things. And so I think the balloons serve as a good visual representation of how privileges can get in the way of people, and the people who have less balloons in front of them may have an easier time of doing things and going through life. So an important piece that I'm going to be speaking about quite often in this presentation is dominant versus subordinate identities, and I think this ties a lot in with privilege, and this was brought up by Vernon Wall in his 10 Myths About Social Justice program at the White Privilege Conference 2015, and he spoke about how we all have dominant and subordinate identities, and this directly relates back to privilege. So our dominant identities are the areas where we have privileges, and the subordinate are areas where we don't. So for example, I am a white female, so my dominant identity there is that I'm white, and then my subordinate identity is that I am female. So I would really, a lot of my presentation is focusing more on these, because I think that is an easier concept for students to grasp onto rather than just the broad spectrum of privilege. So, moving right along. Next up is fostering a safe and developmental discussion. So beyond just the visual representation of showing privilege with the balloons, I really want to have a discussion with the students about what privilege is and what does privilege mean. So really covering what does privilege mean. In the text, Understanding White Privilege, Creating Pathways to Authentic Relationships Across Race, Frances Kendall states that privilege is a right, immunity, or benefit enjoyed only by a person beyond the advantages of most. So many people who have privilege, it's difficult for those to see because they were more often than not born with it or born into it, and there's really nothing that you can do. It just happens. So it's something that is given to you without really doing anything. So an example and something that would be easy for students to kind of see is right versus left, because this isn't jumping into the whole race issue, but right versus left-handed. So people who are right-handed are privileged over people who have left hand. So kind of give examples of privilege. Also during the presentation, kind of have students or whomever's in the room give some examples of privilege or lack thereof as well. So the next part about creating the discussion that I would like to do is have the participants identify both one dominant and one subordinate identity. So once again, the dominant an identity that the individual has where they receive privilege, and one subordinate where they don't receive privilege. So once they have at least one dominant and one subordinate identity, I would really like to have the conversation with the individuals about how privilege is relative. So Jamie Utt, in their blog, Everyday Feminism, they posted a piece about how to talk to someone about privilege who doesn't know what it is. So really discussing with individuals how privilege is relative. So even though, for example, I am female, I may have a different experience than someone else who is female, depending on where they grew up, who they interacted with, those sorts of things. So everyone's dominant and subordinate identities are relative. So me being one is not above the other, and it's a spectrum, and it depends on how the individual feels or thinks about a certain position for the privilege. So really stressing that it's a relative thing. It's not concrete. So one person may be much more affected by a lack of privilege than another person. So it all depends on how many subordinate identities or dominant identities that individual may have. So just a reminder that it's not a clear cookie cutter issue, and that it's constantly changing, and it's all up to the individual's perception. The next piece that I would like to discuss is the subordinate identities and sharing that. And this goes along with both what Jamie Utt has to say and Vernon Wall because of the subordinate identity piece. But Jamie speaks about having people share about their lack of privileges or their subordinate identities because that is much easier to focus on an area where everyone feels or thinks as though they lack, and so it's easier to talk about an area that you lack rather than an area that you're privileged in. So starting with that and then moving your way up to the dominant identity. So starting with the subordinate, talking about the subordinate identity, and then moving up to your dominant identity. Moving right along into discussion is to really look within yourself. So I really want the attendees to look within themselves. Kendall states, those of us who are white can't choose not to get the privileges we are granted, but we can choose how to use them to make personal and systemic changes. So really, we need to look within ourselves before we can change anything else. So really, looking within who we are, what our privileges are, and identifying where we stand before we can really strike up a whole bunch of things and really go on this mission. So really looking within ourselves, seeing where we are and what part of the spectrum we are in terms of enabling more privileges of happening or disabling, that sort of thing. So really looking within the self. Robin DiAngelo spoke about in their piece about how their financial situation made them feel as though they were less of a person, and so because they did not feel that they were up to the quality of other individuals who were white, they didn't have any legs to stand on when they saw certain injustices happening. So it's really important to realize where you're at and, show that, we all have these dominant and subordinate identities. So it's important to look within yourself first so that you can recognize where you're at and then see some of the other issues that are outside your own as well that may be affecting others. The next piece is to kind of when to engage and when to speak up. So, when it's important to engage others in discussion and to talk about certain issues, and when it is important to speak up about a certain issue when you hear something going on. So, a little bit of bystander intervention as well. So, the stress of the confronting and paralysis that people can feel when they have to confront certain situations was taken from Howard Stevenson's If Elephants Could Talk presentation. He really stressed about how any sort of confrontation between anyone when it comes down to race or inequalities really gets the flight or fight response going. So really addressing that sort of confrontation and that everyone feels this sort of stress when confronting different situations. The next piece is the beware of the SIA. So SIA is single awareness activism. This was once again presented by Vernon Wall. What he spoke about was that sometimes when we are so focused on our subordinate identities, that becomes our one pedestal to stand on, our one soapbox, and we become blind to what else is happening to us. So a lot of the times when you're so focused on the one, you may be just putting off other things that are happening around you. So it's important for individuals to not be blindsided by just one thing and be focused on everything that's happening around them and all of the many issues that could be addressed in their lives. And then finally is just reflecting on yourself. So really looking within to try and make a plan and to see what you can do in order to make a difference on your campus. So that would be the final piece of the discussion. So moving right along, beyond the presentation, after I've worked with the different RAs and given them the presentation and what I would like to say, I would like to do an assessment piece with them, what they liked about the presentation, what they didn't like, and get some feedback from them. With that feedback, I'll make adjustment to the presentation, what I need to change, what I should do the same, things I should do more of, and working from there. Next, I would really love to share this program with different organizations across campus if they're interested, as well as different departments. So if this is something that they would like to do in order to spread awareness, I would love to share this program and really do it elsewhere. The other piece would be reaching out beyond student leaders. So hopefully the resident assistants would come to me and ask me to use this program and to do it within their own residence hall. So this is beyond just the student leaders. So the student leaders to students. So whether that's RAs doing it or myself, I think it would be important to show this to students, regular students, and get them thinking about privilege and what it really means. The last piece that I would like to go and discuss beyond the presentation is the NASPA and ACPA competency coverage that this presentation would do. It really touches on the equity, diversity, and inclusion competency and really focuses a lot on equity and diversity and focusing on that within the university. And this really ties into the university's mission and UW-Platteville's Residence Life mission, where we are creating inclusive environments for all. So by doing this presentation, we are helping to foster inclusive environments in the residence halls and on campus. So this is just a final recap. So with the whole presentation, we will be doing the balloon activity where the students will have the balloons on their arms and we'll cut them off when they have privilege. Meaningful discussion, really focusing on self, the dominant and subordinate identities, not having SIA, and then also realizing that privilege is relative and just reflecting on self. And then subordinate and dominant identities, having people really focus on those as well as the privileges that they're facing, and then moving beyond the activity is what we've touched on. So one final quote I would like to leave you all with is from the Kendall text, but it was by David Tulin. It's, "Our first task then is to become comfortable with the uncomfortable and uncomfortable with the too comfortable." So really challenging everything that is happening around us. So I want to thank you all for listening, and I really hope you enjoyed my presentation, and I hope to give you more feedback once I have actually completed the Privilege Pop presentation to students on campus. So once again, if you have any questions, please let me know, and thank you for listening.